Um, the train smelled like coal smoke and other people's luggage, and Mara Holloway sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, because that was the only way she could keep them from shaking. She had a window seat, which should have felt like a small mercy, but all it gave her was a view of everything she was leaving behind. The flat, familiar fields of eastern Missouri blurring into streaks of brown and gray, the farmhouses growing smaller and then disappearing entirely, until there was nothing left of home but the fading ache behind her sternum. Home. She almost laughed at the word. Her mother hadn't even walked her to the station. Her brother Calvin had driven her in the wagon, and he'd done it in complete silence, which was somehow worse than anything he could have said. When he'd lifted her bag from the wagon bed and set it on the platform, he hadn't met her eyes. "Calvin," she'd said. "Train'll be here in 10 minutes," he'd said back. That was all. He'd climbed back up onto the wagon seat and clicked his tongue at the horse, and Mara had stood on that platform alone, surrounded by strangers, holding a carpet bag that contained every object she owned in the world, which wasn't many. She was 24 years old. She had buried a husband. She had survived 18 months of a marriage that had not been what anyone, not her, not her family, not certainly Thomas Holloway himself, had expected it to be. Thomas had died of a fever in their second winter together, quietly and without much warning, and instead of the grief that Mara had braced herself for, she had felt something closer to relief, which was the kind of thing a woman could never say out loud, not in her town, not to her family, not to anyone. She hadn't said it, but somehow they'd known, or maybe they hadn't known that specifically. Maybe what they knew was just that Mara was difficult, that she took up too much space, physically, yes, because she was a large woman with wide shoulders and a solid frame that her mother had described more than once as unfortunate, but also in other ways. She had opinions. She pushed back. She didn't cry prettily or faint or flutter, and she didn't know how to make herself smaller in the ways that were expected of her. She was 24, widowed, and apparently unemployable in any household where her presence would reflect upon the family. Her sister-in-law Ruth had made that very clear in the conversation 3 weeks ago that had set everything in motion. "It's not that nobody cares about you," Ruth had said, in that particular tone of voice that meant the opposite. "It's just that you make things harder than they need to be. You have a way of," she'd waved her hand, "making people uncomfortable." "I make people uncomfortable," Mara had repeated. "You know what I mean?" "I'm not sure I do. I'd appreciate it if you'd say it plainly." Ruth had pressed her lips together. "Calvin's been offered a partnership with Hennessy Grain. It's a real opportunity, Mara. But Hennessy is a particular kind of man, and his wife is a particular kind of woman, and they've made it known that they're uncomfortable with," another wave, "the situation. The situation. Your situation." There it was. Mara had nodded slowly. A widowed woman living in her brother's house is bad for business. "It's not just that, it's..." Ruth had looked away. "People talk." What they talked about, Mara had gathered in pieces over the following days, was everything. The fact that Thomas had died when he did. The fact that she hadn't wept at the funeral, not visibly. The fact that she was the wrong size and the wrong temperament, and had a way of looking at people that some found bold and others found accusatory. The fact that she was, in some way that no one could quite articulate but everyone seemed to feel, simply wrong. 3 weeks later, she'd been put on a train to a settlement 3 states west called Blackstone Ridge, where a woman named Agnes Pullman, a distant acquaintance of her mother's, had apparently agreed to employ her as a housekeeping help. She'd had a letter. She'd had the address. She'd had $12 tucked into her boot. The letter, as it turned out, had been written 6 months before Agnes Pullman died of a bad winter and was never sent to anyone except Mara's mother, who had perhaps not been aware of this detail or had chosen not to share it. Mara found this out when she stepped off the train at Blackstone Ridge and asked a woman at the platform about the Pullman house, and the woman had looked at her with something between pity and confusion and said, "Agnes Pullman passed last March, honey. Didn't you know?" Mara had stood there on the platform with her carpet bag and said, "No, I didn't know. Blackstone Ridge was the kind of town that announced its nature immediately. It wasn't a bad town, not exactly, but it was a closed one. The kind of place that had been built by hard people in hard conditions and had developed, as a result, a particular suspicion of newcomers and a very specific set of rules about who belonged and who didn't. The main street was unpaved but solid, beaten down by years of wagon traffic into something close to stone. There was a general store, a feed merchant, a small church with a crooked steeple, a barber, and a place that served food from a window and could charitably be called a restaurant. There was a hotel that had 8 rooms and a cot in the hall for overflow. Mara walked the length of the street twice, slowly, while people watched. They did watch. She felt it. The way attention tracks the unfamiliar thing. The way eyes follow what doesn't fit. She was aware of her own size, her own solidity, the way her boots hit the ground with more weight than some women's. She was aware that her dress was travel-worn and her hair had not survived the journey with any dignity. She stopped in front of the general store. A man was loading sacks of flour into a wagon bed, moving with the efficient economy of someone who did physical work every day and had long since stopped thinking about it. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, tall, with dark hair going a little gray at the temples, and the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outside. He wasn't handsome, exactly, but he had a directness to his features that was striking. He looked like someone who made decisions. Standing near the wagon, clearly waiting, were 2 small girls. Twins, or near enough. They were identical in the way of certain siblings, matching dark braids, matching serious expressions, matching worn pinafores. They looked about 6, maybe 7. One of them saw Mara and tugged on the other's sleeve. They both stared. Mara was accustomed to being stared at. She met their eyes and nodded politely, the way she would have nodded at anyone. The girl who tugged her sister's sleeve, Mara would later learn she was June, the more decisive of the two, suddenly pointed directly at her. "Daddy," June said, "we want her." The man loading flour stopped and turned. He looked at Mara. Mara looked back at him. "June," the man said, in a tone that suggested this was not the first time he'd had to exercise patience with his daughter. "You can't just—" "We want her," the other twin, Elsie, confirmed, with the gravity of someone issuing a formal request. "She looks like she'd be good." "Good at what?" he said. "At being there," Elsie said, as if this should have been obvious. A small crowd had gathered by this point, the way small-town crowds do. Not obviously, not all at once, but by degrees, people finding reasons to stop and examine something nearby. A woman near the post office had paused in conversation with her companion. 2 men leaning outside the barber's had turned. The restaurant window had a face in it. Mara could hear what they were thinking. She'd been hearing it her whole life. The version of it that didn't use words but was in every turned head and sideways glance. Not right. Not what we expected. Not what we'd have chosen. The man was still looking at her. His eyes were dark, serious, and unreadable in a way that was neither unkind nor particularly warm. He was taking stock of her the way a person takes stock of a situation. Not judgment, exactly, but assessment. "You just arrive?" he said. "On the morning train? You got people here?" She might have lied. It would have been easier to lie. But Mara had spent a significant portion of her life lying by omission or implication, and she was tired of it. "No," she said. "I came for a position with Agnes Pullman. I've just been told she passed." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite sympathy. More like recognition. "That was last March." "I understand that now." "So you got nowhere to go." "I got a hotel," she said, "and enough money for a few nights. After that, I'll find something." He was quiet for a moment. The 2 girls were watching him with the focused intensity of children who understood that something important was being decided. "I'm Silas Creed," he said finally. "I run a cattle ranch about 4 miles north. My wife passed 2 years back. My girls need someone to help with the house and with them. I can't pay much. The house needs work." He said it all plainly, like a man who'd learned that offering too much description of a bad situation only made people distrust you. Mara looked at the girls. Elsie had folded her hands in front of her like she was at church. June had her chin tilted up slightly, a posture that looked like hope with armor on it. She looked back at Silas Creed. "What happened to the last person who helped?" A short pause. "She left in November, said the winters were too hard." "What kind of winters are we talking?" "Hard ones." Mara was quiet for a moment. Around them, the street held its breath. "All right," she said. She heard someone near the post office say something under their breath. She heard a man's low laugh. She didn't turn to look. They drove north in his wagon, Silas in front with the reins, Mara in the bed with the flour sacks and the girls, who sat on either side of her with the cheerful confidence of children who'd already decided something was settled. "What's your name?" Elsie asked. "Mara." "That's a good name," Elsie decided. "What do you know how to do?" June asked. "June," Silas said from the front without looking back. "What?" June said. "It's important." Mara almost smiled. "I can cook, I can clean, I can sew, though not beautifully. I can do accounts, I can plant and tend a kitchen garden. I can handle most animals. I know how to do small repairs, carpentry, not expert, but serviceable." She paused. "I can also set a broken bone if the doctor's too far away, though I'd rather not." June stared at her. "Have you done it before?" "Twice." "Did it work?" "Mostly." June nodded with satisfaction, apparently filing this away. The land opened up around them as they moved north. Wide grass prairie, the sky enormous and pale blue above it, the Rockies a distant suggestion at the edge of vision. It was beautiful in the way of things that didn't care whether you found them beautiful, which was the truest kind. Mara watched it pass and kept her feelings to herself, which was another thing she was practiced at. The ranch house was exactly what Silas had told her to expect, which she appreciated. He hadn't sold it to her. It was a 2-story wooden house that had once been solid and now was tired. The porch railings sagged. One of the shutters had come loose from its hinge and sat at an angle, and the garden in front was a tangle of dead growth that had been left to defeat itself over a season or two. Inside, the rooms were clean enough, but had the particular emptiness of spaces that hadn't been properly inhabited in a while. Furniture that no one sat in, curtains that were never opened, a kitchen that showed the marks of being used for function rather than comfort. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece. A woman, dark-haired, with the twins' same serious eyes. Young. Mara looked at it once and didn't look again. "Your room's through there," Silas said, pointing to a door off the kitchen. It was small, just big enough for a cot and a dresser, but it had a window facing east, which meant morning light, which Mara had always considered the best kind. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He seemed like a man who'd learned to express himself mostly in nods and the particular quality of his silences. "Supper's usually at 6. Girls eat first." "What do they like?" He blinked, like the question had caught him off guard. "What do they like to eat?" "Yes." He thought about it. "Elsie won't eat onions. June will eat anything but puts too much salt on everything. They both like cornbread." He said it carefully, like he was proud of knowing it, which made something in Mara's chest pull tight in a way she hadn't expected. "All right," she said. "I'll figure the rest out." He nodded again and went back outside. She heard his boots on the porch steps, and then the sound of the barn. Mara stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked around at it, the dull stove, the low stack of wood, the single pot hanging from the ceiling hook, the window over the sink where the glass had a crack running through the lower pane. She put her bag in her room. She found an apron on a hook by the door. She started working. She worked without stopping for 4 hours before she heard anyone else move in the house. The girls came down from wherever they'd been and found her on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor, which had not been scrubbed properly in longer than she cared to think about. "You don't have to do that," Elsie said. "I know," Mara said, and kept scrubbing. "Our last helper didn't do that," June said. "She said the floor was good enough." It wasn't. June crouched down to examine her work with the focused inspection of a small person taking a quality seriously. "That's better," she acknowledged. "Yes," Mara agreed. "Can we help?" She looked at them. 2 small faces, hopeful and uncertain and trying not to be. "You can dry," she said, "after I wash the dishes." They helped dry the dishes. They were not efficient, and Elsie dropped a bowl that was mercifully not breakable. And June kept up a running commentary on everything that had happened in the town and on the ranch in the past several months that Mara hadn't asked for and was grateful to receive, because it told her things she needed to know. Who to watch out for in town, what the neighbors were like, where the fence on the east pasture was broken, that the barn cat had recently had kittens, that their father had not been sleeping well for 2 years. "How do you know he doesn't sleep?" Mara asked. "We hear him," Elsie said quietly, with the directness of a child who doesn't yet know that some things are better left unobserved. "At night," Walking around. Mara nodded. She understood that kind of sleeplessness. She made them supper, beans and salt pork and cornbread, simple and hot. And she set a bowl aside for Silas without being asked. He came in from the barn with mud on his boots and stopped in the doorway when he smelled food, like he'd almost forgotten that hot food was a thing that could exist. He ate at the table with the girls while Mara cleaned up, and nobody said very much, but it was the kind of silence that was different from the silence on the street. It had weight to it, the good kind. "That was fine," Silas said when the bowl was empty. It was not effusive praise, but he said it like he meant it. "There's more if you want it," Mara said. He had more. That night, in her small east-facing room, Mara lay on the cot that was narrow and slightly uneven and listened to the sound of the prairie at night, wind, insects, the occasional low sound from the barn, and thought about the fact that she didn't know if any of this would work. She didn't know if she was capable of being what this place needed. She didn't know if she could outrun the reputation that had followed her off the train and into Blackstone Ridge's collective awareness. She'd already seen it in the faces on the street, the particular way people looked at a woman who didn't fit and who'd been discarded, and who showed up alone and displaced and in need, because need was the most unflattering thing a person could display in a town that had built its identity on sufficiency. She also didn't know what she was hoping for, which was perhaps the more dangerous uncertainty. She didn't want to hope for anything. Hoping was a kind of exposure, and she'd been exposed enough. The wind moved through the crack in the kitchen window and made a sound like someone trying to get in. Mara closed her eyes. She thought about the way June had looked at her on the street. That pointed finger, that absolute certainty. We want her. Not tentative, not polite, just direct, the way children are direct when they haven't yet learned to dress desire in better clothes. She thought about Elsie saying, "She looks like she'd be good at being there." She hadn't been good at being there historically. She'd been too much and too little of the wrong things in every place she'd inhabited. But this place was different from any other she'd been. This place had two children who'd pointed at her like she was the answer to something they'd been silently asking for a long time. She didn't know what to do with that. She fell asleep without deciding. In the morning, she was up before the sun. She built the fire in the stove while the house was still dark, and she had coffee made and biscuits in the pan by the time the first gray light came through the east window. She went out to the well for water and checked the state of the garden in the early light, making a mental list. She examined the loose shutter and found that it needed only one new pin, which she could probably manage. She walked the length of the front porch and identified the boards that needed replacing. When she came back inside, Silas was standing in the kitchen with his hair still uncombed and his shirt half buttoned, looking at the coffee like he wasn't sure it was real. "You were up early?" he said. "I'm always up early." He poured himself a cup and looked at her sidelong. "You don't have to—" "I know what I don't have to do," she said, not unkindly. "I know what needs doing too. Those are different things." He was quiet. He drank his coffee. Outside, a rooster announced its intentions to the morning. "Fence on the east pasture," she said. "June told me about it." "How bad?" He blinked. "You planning to fix fences?" "If you show me how. I told you. I can do serviceable carpentry." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, unreadable eyes. She held his gaze steadily, the way she'd learned to hold it everywhere, because looking away first had always cost her more than looking away was worth. "I'll show you after the morning feed," he said. "Good," she said. "The shutter on the south side needs a pin. I can do that myself if you have the hardware." He pointed to a tin box on the shelf by the door. "Hardware's in there." "Thank you." He took his coffee and went to the barn. She fixed the shutter before breakfast. Blackstone Ridge did not warm to her. She went to town twice in the first 2 weeks, once for supplies, once with Silas and the girls, and both times she felt the street in the way she'd felt it on the first day. The watching. The cataloging. A woman named Mrs. Heller, who apparently served as the town's primary social accountant, stopped her near the dry goods store on the second visit and looked at her with an expression that managed to be both pitying and satisfied at the same time, which was a difficult combination to achieve. "You're the Holloway woman," Mrs. Heller said. It was not a question. "I am," Mara said. "Widowed young, I hear. Came here for Agnes Pullman." "That's right." And now you're out at the Creed place. Mrs. Heller's voice carried the particular emphasis of someone making a point without making it directly. I'm working there? Yes. Hmm? The sound landed like a stone in water, sending out small rings of implication. Well, Silas Creed is a hard man in a hard situation. I suppose he takes what's available. Mara looked at her. He does, she said evenly. And so does she. Mrs. Heller's face stiffened. Mara picked up her parcel from the counter and carried it to the wagon. She didn't let herself shake until she was in the wagon bed with the girls. And even then, she kept her hands folded tight in her lap and made sure her face showed nothing. June was watching her with those sharp eyes. She's not very nice, June said. No, Mara agreed. Daddy says to ignore her. Your daddy is right. Do you ignore her? I try, Mara said. I don't always succeed. June considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Me neither, she said, in a tone of profound solidarity. The ranch improved. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and repairs and mornings where the stove smoked and afternoons where something in the fence line needed attention again, and evenings where everyone was too tired to say much of anything. But it improved. The garden got cleared. Mara found seeds in the barn, someone's old box neglected, and planted what the season allowed. She got the east fence serviceable with Silas's guidance and, on 2 subsequent sections, without it. She recaulked the kitchen window. She learned the rhythms of the house and the rhythms of the girls, who were not easy children. They were stubborn and loud and had strong opinions, and occasionally tested her with the calculated defiance of small people measuring a new presence. And she did not pretend they were easier than they were, which, she suspected, was why they'd started to trust her. With Silas, it was different. He was not cold exactly, but he was contained. He was a man who'd learned to keep most of himself behind something solid, and he wasn't offering Mara any view inside. She didn't push for one. She understood that kind of protection. But occasionally, late at night when the girls were asleep and she was still working on something at the kitchen table, mending, accounts, whatever had accumulated, and he'd come in from the last barn check and stop in the kitchen doorway, she'd feel the quality of his attention even when he didn't speak, like he was cataloging something, like she surprised him in some small way each time. He never said what the surprise was. She didn't ask. That was the shape of things at the Creed Ranch in those early weeks. Imperfect and partial, and made up of small quiet moments that were neither enough nor nothing, and a barn cat who left dead mice on the porch as apparent tribute, and 2 girls who'd started calling her Mara with the particular familiarity of people who decided you were theirs. She had not allowed herself to call it home, but she'd stopped being surprised each morning when she opened her eyes to the east-facing window and didn't feel the need to be somewhere else. That was something. In Mara Holloway's experience, that was more than most. The barn cat was named Gerald. She found this out on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into her time at the Creed Ranch, when she was carrying a bucket of scraps out to the porch, and the cat appeared from beneath the steps with a dead field mouse in its mouth and dropped it directly in front of her boot with the solemn satisfaction of something that had completed a mission. Gerald, June said from where she was sitting on the porch rail watching. He does that when he likes you. Mara looked down at the mouse. That's his way of showing it. He never did it for our last helper. Lucky her, Mara said, and picked up the mouse with 2 fingers and deposited it in the scraps bucket, which made June laugh so suddenly and fully that she nearly fell off the rail. It wasn't a significant moment. It was just a Tuesday morning in late spring with a bucket of scraps and a self-important cat and a child laughing on a porch rail. But Mara filed it away in the part of herself that collected small good things, because she'd learned early that those were often the only kind on offer, and ignoring them was a waste. The garden was coming in, not abundantly. The soil was thin in places and she'd had to work compost into 2 of the beds, but coming in. She could see the first green threads of beans and the stubborn little fists of potato plants pushing through. She checked the rows each morning before the house woke, running her fingers through the soil with the focused attention of someone who understood that growing things required witness. If you didn't pay attention, they didn't fail dramatically. They just faded quietly while you were looking elsewhere. She knew something about that. The house was different than it had been when she arrived. Not transformed. She was clear-eyed about what one person with serviceable skills and limited supplies could accomplish in a month. But different. The shutter sat straight. The kitchen window was sealed against the wind. She'd scrubbed the floors twice and cleaned the chimney and organized the kitchen so that things could be found when needed, which had not previously been the case. She'd taken down the curtains in the parlor, washed them, rehung them, and opened them, and the light that came in made the room look less like a place a person had stopped inhabiting and more like a place a person might sit. Silas noticed. He didn't say much about it. He wasn't a man built for much, but he noticed. She could tell because he'd taken to sitting in the parlor after supper some evenings, instead of going directly back to the barn or retreating upstairs. And once she'd found him with a book open in the chair that had sat empty since she'd come, just sitting there, not doing anything alarming, just sitting in the light. She'd left him to it. She'd learned that about him. He needed to be left alone without feeling abandoned, which was a narrow passage to navigate, but she was getting the shape of it. The harder thing was the town. It had been 6 weeks. She'd been to Blackstone Ridge 4 times, and 4 times she'd felt the particular social weather of a place that had decided about her already and wasn't inclined to revise its position. Women crossed the street not dramatically, but just enough. Just a subtle angling away that accomplished the same thing without the commitment of a real snub. Men were more direct in their indirectness, the kind of eye contact that went through you instead of at you. At the general store, a man named Pruitt, who ran the place, had started being slightly less efficient at finding her items than he was with other customers. A small and deniable thing that was nevertheless deliberate. She bought what she needed and didn't make a scene and came back to the ranch. She didn't tell Silas about any of it because it wasn't his problem to solve, and she hadn't come here to be rescued. What she didn't expect was that the girls would notice. "Why don't people talk to you in town?" Elsie asked one evening, direct as a thrown stone, while Mara was braiding her hair for bed. "Some people do," Mara said. "Mrs. Alderman doesn't. She looks at you like—" Elsie made a face that was some approximation of stiff disapproval. "People take time to know someone new. It's been a long time. 6 weeks isn't long for some people." Elsie was quiet while Mara finished the braid. Then she said very quietly, "Is it because you're bigger than other ladies?" The question landed. Mara let it land, didn't flinch from it. "That's part of it," she said honestly. "People sometimes decide things about you before they know you, based on how you look, or that you're new, or that your story doesn't match what they expected. That's not fair. No. Does it make you sad?" Mara tied off the braid and smoothed it with her palm. "Sometimes," she said. "Not as much as it used to." Elsie turned around and looked at her with those dark eyes that saw more than a 7-year-old's eyes had any business seeing. "I told Mrs. Alderman you're good," she said. "At school. She didn't say anything back, but she heard me." Mara looked at this child, this small, fierce thing sitting on the edge of her bed with her braid and her conviction, and felt something shift under her ribs that she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said. Came out rougher than she meant it to. "You're welcome," Elsie said, with the matter-of-fact grace of someone who didn't understand that what she'd done was remarkable. Mara went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment, not doing anything, just standing there while the darkness pressed against the window glass. Then she washed the dishes and went to bed. The next morning she was up before the sun, same as always. But the thing that had shifted under her ribs stayed shifted. It didn't go back. Silas found her in the garden at first light, which had become a kind of pattern. Him doing the early barn work, her doing the early garden check, both of them crossing paths in the gray hour before the household fully woke. It was the only time they really talked, which may have been because the early morning had a different quality than the rest of the day, something in the light and the quiet that made it easier to say things. "Soil's getting better in the north bed," she said, not looking up from where she was turning the edge of a row. He stopped near the fence. "You put compost down?" "Last week and the week before. The drainage was wrong. It says it was sitting wet." She sat back on her heels. "You've got a good natural slope in the east plot. If we redirect one of the water channels from the well, you could irrigate 2 beds without carrying." He looked at the garden for a moment, then at her. "You figured that out yourself?" "I've been thinking about it for a while. I could be wrong." "You're not usually wrong," he said, which was the closest he'd come to a compliment in 6 weeks, and which he said with the same flat delivery he used for everything, so she might have missed it if she hadn't been listening. She went back to turning the soil. He didn't leave. Elsie said something to you last night, he said. She asked good questions. She said she told you about Mrs. Alderman. A pause. I've spoken to Alderman before. About the way his wife. Don't, Mara said. She said it without sharpness, just clearly. He stopped. I don't need you to fight that for me, she said. I can carry it. It's not your fight. It's on my account, partially. Maybe, but doing something about it makes me a problem that needs solving, and I'm not interested in being that. She looked up at him. I'm interested in being useful and being let alone. And those two things together will do more for my standing than any conversation with Alderman. He held her gaze. His jaw worked slightly, the way it did when he was deciding something. You're stubborn, he said finally. Yes, she agreed. I am. He almost smiled. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was the architectural possibility of one. Then he turned and went to the barn. She watched him go and then looked back at her rose and thought, not for the first time, that Silas Creed was not what she'd expected from a man described as feared and iron-willed. He was of those things, yes. She didn't doubt that he could be hard when hardness was required. But under it there was something that had not fully calcified, some place that was still, improbably, open. She didn't let herself think too long about that. It was one of those thoughts that, looked at too directly, had a way of turning into something inconvenient. The real trouble started on a Thursday, which was the day she went to town alone for the first time. She decided to take the wagon herself. Silas was occupied with a problem in the north pasture, something with a water line, and the girls needed supplies for a school project that couldn't wait. She hitched the horse, which she'd been doing for weeks and had gotten reasonably efficient at, and drove the 4 miles into Blackstone Ridge with a short list and the particular steeliness she put on for town. She got most of what she needed without incident. Pruitt was slow with the goods, same as always, but she waited. She picked up the girls' supplies at the dry goods store, where a teenager behind the counter was efficient and disinterested and thus easier to deal with than most adults. She was loading the wagon when she heard them. 3 women standing near the post office, not troubling to lower their voices much. She knew 2 of them. Mrs. Heller, naturally, who seemed to make it her business to be wherever something was being said, and a woman named Dorothy Price, whose husband ran the feed merchant. The third she didn't recognize. Don't know how Silas thinks this is appropriate, Mrs. Heller was saying. A strange woman living under his roof, unattached. Agnes Pullman sent for her, Dorothy said more quietly, in what was possibly an attempt at fairness. Agnes is dead. That doesn't obligate Silas to take in a charity case from Missouri. She's doing the work, by all accounts. There are other women who could do the work. A pause, heavy with implication. Women from here. Women whose reputations are... Another pause. Appropriate. Silas isn't looking for that, Dorothy said. Silas isn't looking for anything because he's still half dead with grief. And there are people who know how to take advantage of that. Mara set the last parcel in the wagon bed. Her hands were completely steady. She'd had practice. She climbed up onto the seat. She didn't look at them. She gathered the reins, clicked her tongue at the horse, and drove out of Blackstone Ridge without acknowledging that she'd heard a single word, because acknowledging it would have been a kind of defeat, and she was not interested in defeat. On the way back to the ranch, she went over what she'd heard and sorted through the feelings it produced with the methodical privacy she applied to most of her interior life. There was anger, yes. The hot, impotent kind that came from hearing yourself described as a predator by people who'd met you twice and decided they understood you. There was something older and colder underneath the anger, the thing that said, see, you knew this. You always knew this. The voice that had been with her long enough that she sometimes forgot it wasn't her own. She told that voice to be quiet. She drove back to the ranch. She unloaded the wagon. She started supper. When Silas came in from the north pasture, mud to the knees, looking like the water line had not cooperated, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and sniffed. Stew, he said. If you want to wash up, it'll be ready in 20 minutes. He went upstairs. She heard the water running. She heard him come back down. She heard him stop in the doorway again, and when she turned around, he was looking at her with that particular quality of attention she'd started to recognize, the one that meant he was noticing something he hadn't expected. Something happened in town? He said. She turned back to the stove. No. A silence. She could feel him deciding how hard to push. Mara, I got everything on the list. Girls' supplies are on the table. A longer silence. Then he said, You don't have to carry everything yourself. It was such a simple sentence. She didn't know why it landed the way it did. Somewhere behind her sternum, a small, deliberate blow. Supper in 20, she said, and kept her eyes on the stove. He didn't push further. She was both glad and not. What she didn't know that evening was that he'd heard. Not from her. She hadn't said a word. But a man named Fletcher, who worked a neighboring spread, had been near the post office that afternoon and was apparently a man who believed in keeping his neighbors informed. He'd stopped by the ranch the following morning, and Mara was in the garden when he arrived and couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched it from a distance. The two men standing by the fence, Fletcher doing most of the talking, Silas getting very still in the particular way he got still when something made him angry. Fletcher left after 10 minutes. Silas stood by the fence alone for another 2, then walked back toward the barn. He didn't say anything to her, not that day and not the next. But the following Wednesday, when they went into town together, all 4 of them, he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He walked beside her on the street. Not behind her, not ahead. Beside her, with the girls between them, and when Mrs. Heller approached with her particular expression of arranged concern, Silas nodded at her in a way that was not unfriendly, but was also completely without apology, and said, "Morning, Helen," and kept walking. Mara kept walking too. She didn't let herself look at him, but she registered it. She registered it and filed it away next to the Tuesday morning with Gerald the cat and Elsie's braid and the almost smile at the corner of his mouth, and the part of herself that collected small, good things. June noticed because June noticed everything. She tucked her hand into Mara's as they walked down the street, just slid her small hand in like it was the most natural thing, like she'd been doing it for years. And Mara held it without making a production of it, without comment, because sometimes the best way to honor a thing was to just let it be. The garden came in stronger through June. The beans ran up their poles and the potatoes swelled in the ground, and the kitchen had the smell of things growing nearby, which was one of those smells that Mara associated with being somewhere real, somewhere that intended to persist. She started a herb patch along the south wall, just small things, thyme and sage and some wild mint she'd found near the creek, and the girls took a proprietary interest in it, checking the progress each day with great seriousness. "The mint's getting aggressive," June reported one evening, in a tone suggesting this was both a problem and possibly impressive. "It does that," Mara said. "Mint always thinks it's in charge. Are you going to stop it? I'll keep it from taking over, but you can't fully stop Mint. You have to negotiate." June considered this. "Like with Elsie," she said. Mara bit the inside of her cheek. "Somewhat," she said. Elsie, who was sitting nearby doing her reading, looked up. "I heard that. You were meant to," June said serenely. These were the evenings that Mara would not let herself examine too carefully. The kitchen lit by lamplight, the girls at the table with their schoolwork, the sound of Silas moving around upstairs or out on the porch, the cat somewhere asserting his opinions about dinner, the smell of the herb garden coming through the window that now opened and closed properly because she'd fixed the latch. These evenings had a texture that she was starting to recognize as dangerous, because it was the texture of the thing she'd told herself she didn't expect, which was belonging. She was not naive about it. She understood that warmth was not security. She understood that a temporary position in a man's household was not a life, and that 2 little girls who held her hand on the street were not a family, and that liking a place and being wanted in a place were 2 different things that could easily become confused. She'd been confused before. She knew what it cost, so she kept working. She kept her room tidy and her expectations managed, and she did not let herself think about what came after. She had $12 that had become $8 and then become $12 again because Silas paid her on the 1st of the month without ceremony, just an envelope left on the kitchen table with the accounts. She had a roof. She had work. She had, improbably, a cat who left her offerings and 2 children who thought she could negotiate with Mint, and a man who walked beside her on a street where people watched. It was not nothing. What she didn't account for, in all her careful management of expectations, was what happened on the 3rd Tuesday of July. The girls had been at school. Silas had been in the north pasture again. There was always something in the north pasture. It was that kind of pasture. And Mara had been repairing a section of the vegetable garden fence that the wind had worried loose, which was repetitive work and gave her mind too much room to wander. She was kneeling in the dirt, working a fence post back into true, when she heard the wagon. It was a fine wagon, better than anything in Blackstone Ridge's general inventory, and the man driving it was dressed better than the occasion warranted, in a town suit that looked like it had been bought in the city and made the prairie feel faintly embarrassed about its appearance. He was somewhere in his 50s, gray-haired and prosperously built, with the expression of someone who was accustomed to arriving and being attended to. She didn't know him. She stood up because kneeling in the dirt in front of strangers was an indignity she could avoid. She dusted off her hands. She waited. "Looking for Silas Creed," the man said without greeting her. "He's in the north pasture. I can send word." The man looked at her the way Mrs. Heller looked at her, with that particular thoroughness that was less observation than categorization. "You the housekeeper?" "Yes." He climbed down from the wagon with the unhurried movement of a man who expected his unhurriedness to be accommodated. "I'll wait." She showed him to the porch. She didn't offer him the parlor because she didn't know who he was, and until she did, the porch was enough. She brought him water, which he accepted without thanks, and she went back to the fence. His name, she discovered when Silas returned 40 minutes later, was Wendell Kane. He was the largest landowner in the county, which was the kind of information that explained a great deal about his bearing. He'd come to make Silas an offer on 60 acres of the north pasture, the very pasture where the water line had been giving trouble, which was perhaps not a coincidence. She wasn't supposed to hear any of this. She was in the kitchen, and the two men were on the porch, and the porch was not far enough from the kitchen window for a conversation to remain private, which was not her fault. "It's good land," Kane was saying, "and you're having a time with the water. I can make that problem go away." "The land's not for sale," Silas said. "Everything's for sale at the right number." "Not this." A pause. "The line's fixable. I've got it mostly worked out." "Silas." Kane's tone shifted to something that was almost kind, which was usually the register people used when they were about to say something unkind. "You're a proud man, and I respect that. But you're managing this place alone, and you've got 2 girls to raise, and the fact is, 60 acres you're struggling to water is 60 acres that's bleeding you. Let me take it off." Silence. She could picture Silas's jaw working. "I'll think about it," he said, which was his way of saying no without closing a door he might need later. Kane left. Silas came inside. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and looked at the floor. "You heard," he said. "I wasn't trying to." "I know." He set his hat on the table. He looked tired, not the regular tired of physical work, which he wore like a second skin, but the deeper tired of a person carrying something that didn't get lighter with rest. "The north pasture water issue," she said carefully. "The slope problem. I've been thinking about it since I figured out the garden drainage." He looked at her. "If you redirect the secondary well line and create a collection point at the low corner of the north field, you could gravity feed most of the pasture without the pump. It's not complicated. It's just about where you route it." She paused. "I could show you on paper. I'm not certain, but I think I'm close." He stared at her. "You've been thinking about my north pasture water system." "I think about practical problems," she said. "It's a habit." He kept staring. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down, and he put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment, and she gave him that moment without comment. When he raised his head, something in his expression had changed, the layer that was usually there, the protective flatness, the contained quality, had slipped just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath, which was a man who was bone-tired of doing everything alone and hadn't known how to stop. "Show me on paper," he said. She got the paper. They sat at the kitchen table until the lamp burned low, with a rough sketch between them and 2 cups of coffee going cold, and Mara explained what she'd worked out, and Silas looked at it and found the problems with it. And she adjusted, and he reconsidered, and they went back and forth like 2 people who'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. The girls came home from the neighbors where they'd been sent for the afternoon, found their father, and Mara bent over a piece of paper at the kitchen table, looked at each other, and very quietly went upstairs. Outside, the summer dark settled over the ranch, over the garden coming in, over the fence posts set true, over the north pasture that might not have to be sold. And Mara Holloway, who had not let herself name anything, sat at a kitchen table in the lamplight and let herself stay. The water redirection worked. It took 3 weeks of digging and 2 failed attempts at the collection point and one afternoon where a pipe coupling split and soaked both of them from the knees down, and Silas said a word in front of the girls that he immediately apologized for, and Mara laughed, actually laughed, openly, for the first time since she'd arrived. And the girls looked at each other with the private satisfaction of children witnessing an adult become briefly human. But it worked. By the first week of August, the north pasture had water running to 3/4 of its acreage without the pump, and Silas stood at the fence line on a Sunday morning and looked at it with the expression of a man who'd been bracing for a blow that didn't come. "You were right," he said. "I was mostly right," she said. "You fixed the part I got wrong." "The coupling." "The coupling," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, watching the water move through the channels she'd sketched on paper at the kitchen table 2 months ago. "Kane came by again yesterday," he said, "when you were in the garden." She hadn't known that. "And?" "I told him the land wasn't for sale." He paused. He seemed surprised. "Did that bother you?" Another pause. "No," he said, and the word had a firmness to it that hadn't been there before. "Not this time." She nodded. She didn't make anything more of it, but she knew what he was really saying, and she let it settle in the space between them without requiring it to be said more plainly than that. The summer moved into late August with the particular stubbornness of prairie summers, which didn't release their heat willingly, but held it deep in the ground long after the evenings cooled. The cattle were fat on the restored pasture. The garden had produced more than she'd expected. She'd put up preserves, more jars than the kitchen had shelving for. And Silas had built a rough shelf in the cellar without being asked, which was how he often did things. Noticed the need and addressed it without discussion, as if commentary on the action would diminish it somehow. The girls were in school 5 days a week now, which changed the shape of the days. Mara found herself in a quieter house through the morning hours, working through the tasks that accumulated when small people were around to generate them. Laundry, mending, the endless repair work that an old house required. She didn't mind the quiet. She'd spent enough of her life in rooms full of people who made her feel alone that silence had become something she valued on its own terms. But there were moments, she couldn't help them, where she registered the smallness of her room, the narrowness of her position, the fact that she was in this house on a functional basis and nothing more formal than that, and that nothing had been said about what happened when the function ended or changed or when someone more appropriate came along. She kept those moments short. She'd gotten good at keeping things short that wanted to be longer. What she couldn't keep short was Silas. Not that anything had been said. Nothing had been said. He was not the kind of man who said things before he was certain of them, and she was not the kind of woman who invited what she wasn't sure she could receive. But the evenings at the kitchen table had become a habit, 2, 3 times a week, after the girls were asleep, over the account books or the repair lists, or sometimes nothing particular at all. Just 2 people who'd run out of reasons to be in separate rooms. He'd taken to telling her things. Small things about the ranch, about the neighbors, occasionally about the years before she'd arrived, offered in the careful, sparing way of a man who didn't talk about himself much and was relearning how. One evening in late August, he told her about his wife. He didn't do it directly. He did it the way he did most things, sideways, without announcing it. They'd been going over the winter supply list, and he'd said something about whether to put up more flour than usual, and somehow that had led to him saying that Clara had always baked on Sundays, the way her mother had, and then he'd stop talking in the middle of the sentence like he'd walk through a door he hadn't meant to open. She waited. She'd learned the value of waiting with him. She was 28, he said, finally, when she died. Fever, same as half the county that winter. The girls were 5. He looked at the table. I couldn't figure out how to keep everything going. The ranch and them. I kept thinking I was going to get better at it. Did you? Some? Not enough. A long pause. I kept her things the way they were for a year. Couldn't move them, couldn't look at them. The girls used to go into her room and just sit in there, and I didn't know what to say about it, so I didn't say anything. Mara was quiet. I should have talked to them more, he said. About her. I just didn't know how to do it without... He stopped. Without coming apart, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she understood that. She understood the particular discipline of a grief you couldn't afford to feel fully because there were still things that needed doing, people who needed you functional, and the grief would have to wait, and then the waiting became so long and so practiced that you weren't sure anymore how to stop. You're talking to them now, she said. I've heard you. At night sometimes, when you think everyone's asleep. You tell them things. He looked startled. What kind of things? About the ranch. About what you're planning. About what their mother was like when she was young. She met his eyes. They hear it. It matters to them, even if they're half asleep. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she didn't try to read too specifically, because reading it too specifically would require her to do something about it, and she wasn't ready to do anything about it. You pay attention to things, he said. It's a habit, she said, which was the same thing she'd said about practical problems, because it was the same answer. She paid attention because attention was the thing she had to offer when she didn't have anything else. He nodded slowly. He looked back at the supply list. She looked back at the supply list. They finished the list and then sat there for another 10 minutes, not talking, in the way that had become comfortable. And then Mara said she had an early morning and got up and went to her room. She sat on the edge of her cot in the dark and put her hands over her face and breathed. This was the thing she hadn't accounted for. Not the town and its opinions, not the physical work, not the loneliness. She'd accounted for all of those. She hadn't accounted for this. For a man who told her things sideways and noticed when she'd been to town and built shelves in the cellar without mentioning it and sat in the lamplight until the coffee went cold. For two girls who were becoming, in some gradual and undeniable way, hers. She hadn't accounted for the fact that she could want things here. She had very carefully not wanted anything for a long time. Wanting was exposure. Wanting was the position you were in when something got taken away. She took her hands off her face. She thought, you knew what this was when you agreed to it. She thought, a position is a position, not a life. She thought, he is a man who is still finding his way back from somewhere, and you are a woman who was thrown away, and neither of those things is a foundation. She thought all of these things, and they were all reasonable, and she believed all of them. And then she lay down on her cot and listened to the prairie night, and felt, despite everything, like she was in the right place, which was new, which was the most dangerous thing of all. The storm came in the second week of September. She felt it building for 2 days before it arrived. A particular quality in the air, a pressure change that the animals registered before the people did. Gerald the cat disappeared under the porch on a Wednesday afternoon, and the cattle were restless in the north pasture, and the sky to the southwest had a color that wasn't quite right. A greenish tinge under the gray that Mara had never seen before but recognized instinctively as a warning. Looks bad, she said at supper Wednesday evening. Silas nodded. He'd been watching the sky too. Could be the worst one this season. I need to get the cattle into the south enclosure and check the barn roof. Some of the east boards have been worrying me. What do you need me to do? Keep the girls inside, he said. And if it looks like it's coming fast, get them to the cellar. All right, she said. He looked at her. I mean it, Mara. You stay with the girls. I heard you, she said. Which was not the same as agreeing, and they both knew it. But he didn't push because supper was running out and the sky wasn't waiting. The storm hit Thursday afternoon. It came from the southwest the way those storms do on the open prairie. Fast, without the gradual build you'd expect. One moment a dark mass on the horizon, and what felt like minutes later a wall of wind and rain and sound that swallowed everything. Mara had the girls inside and the windows latched by the time the first wave hit the house, and the noise of it was something she hadn't been prepared for. Not just wind, but a roaring, a physical pressure against the walls that made the house feel suddenly temporary. The girls were frightened. June was trying not to show it, which meant she was very still and very quiet, which was the opposite of her natural state. Elsie had gone pale. Is Daddy okay? Elsie asked. Your daddy's been through storms before, Mara said. He knows what he's doing. But where is he? She didn't know. He'd been in the barn when the storm hit. She'd seen him through the kitchen window, moving with purpose, securing the barn doors. That had been 20 minutes ago. He'll come in when he can, she said. Right now, he needs to make sure the animals are safe. The lights flickered. The house had a kerosene lamp system, and the wind was finding its way through gaps she hadn't identified yet, causing the flames to shudder. She lit a second lamp and set it on the kitchen table, and got the girls sitting on the bench with a blanket, which was partly for warmth and partly because people under blankets felt less exposed to large weather. "Tell us something," June said. Her voice was carefully controlled. "What do you want to hear?" "Anything, just talk." Mara sat across from them and talked. She told them about a storm she'd seen as a girl. Not this bad, a different kind. A flooding rain that had come up from the south and kept them inside for 3 days. She told them about the creek that had run through her family's property and how it had turned the color of brick during floods. She talked steadily, keeping her voice level. And the girls listened, and gradually the stiffness in Elsie's shoulders came down. And June began braiding a piece of fringe from the blanket with restless fingers, which was her version of relaxing. Then lightning hit something close, very close. A crack and flash that came simultaneously, which meant it was directly above. And Elsie screamed once, short and sharp, and June grabbed her sister's hand, and the lamp went out. In the sudden dark, with the storm screaming against the walls, Mara felt her own heartbeat spike. She made herself breathe. "I've got it," she said. She found the matches by feel. She relit the lamp. The girls were holding each other. They were both looking at her. "That was the lightning rod on the barn," she said, though she didn't know that. She said it because it was more specific than I don't know, and specificity was a form of calm. It did its job. The storm did not stop. It moved across the ranch in waves, each one sounding like it would be the last and then not being the last. Mara stayed at the table with the girls, watching the window, watching the door, listening for Silas. An hour passed, maybe longer. She'd lost precise track of time. Then Elsie said, "The cattle." Through the kitchen window in a flash of lightning, Mara had seen it too. The south enclosure gate was open. Whether the wind had worked it loose or something had struck the latch, she couldn't tell. But the gate was open, and the cattle that Silas had moved into the south enclosure were beginning to figure that out. She could also see in the same flash of lightning that Silas wasn't in sight. She stood up. "You two stay here," she said. "Mara," June started. "Blanket, bench, stay. I mean it." She looked at them hard enough that they both went still. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. Do not move." She took the spare oilskin from the hook by the door. She pushed out into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical object, not a metaphor, an actual impact, staggering her sideways on the porch steps. Rain drove horizontal, cold, and hard, and within 10 seconds she was soaked from the neck down. She bent into it and moved toward the south enclosure. The cattle were moving. She could hear them before she could fully see them in the rain and dark. The low, panicked sound of large animals responding to large fear. She found the gate and got it latched. It took both hands and her full weight, the wind fighting her the whole way. The latch clicked home. She turned around. Lightning flashed. In that white, frozen moment of illumination, she saw Silas at the far side of the enclosure, working the fence line, and she saw the gap he was repairing, and she saw the two small figures coming through the barn door. The girls. They hadn't stayed. Later, she would understand that Elsie had seen something from the window. She'd seen her father at the fence, and she'd seen the steer that had separated from the group, the big roan that Silas called the difficult one. And she'd decided that her father needed to know. In her logic, it was perfectly reasonable. She and June had simply taken the oilskin off the other hook and gone to help. In the moment, what Mara saw was this. The roan steer, wild-eyed and panicked and weighing somewhere close to 1,000 pounds, had broken from the small knot of cattle near the barn and was moving in the direction of the two small figures in the doorway, fast, without the control that an animal in its right mind would have, all instinct and fear and momentum. She didn't calculate. There was no time to calculate. She was between the steer and the girls before she was aware of having made the decision to move, her arms out wide, her voice coming up from somewhere below her chest, loud and low and commanding in the way she'd heard work on frightened animals. Not a scream, not a high sound. Something with bass in it, something that cut through the storm noise and reached the animal brain. The steer hit her. Not a full impact. She'd angled herself and gotten a shoulder into its neck as it came, redirecting rather than stopping. The way she'd once read you were supposed to do. though she'd read it in a farming manual and hadn't expected to apply it. The animal's shoulder caught her across the ribs and her left side and threw her into the fence post to her right. She heard the wood of the post and she felt the ground, and then she was lying in the mud with rain driving into her face and the wind screaming overhead. And for a moment she couldn't figure out which direction was up. The steer had veered. She could hear it crashing away somewhere to her left. She could hear Silas yelling. She could hear the girls. She couldn't hear herself, which meant she was probably not making any sound, which seemed like important information. She tried to move her left arm, and the pain that resulted was significant enough that she stopped trying. She moved her right arm instead. She pressed her palm into the mud and pushed and got herself to sitting. Silas was there. She didn't know exactly when he got there. She'd lost a few seconds somewhere. But he was there, kneeling in the mud beside her, his face very close, rain running off his hat brim and dripping onto her shoulder. "Where are you hurt?" he said. "Left side," she managed. "I'm all right." "You're not all right. You went into a fence post." "The girls." "June has Elsie. They're fine. Mara—" His hands were on her face, briefly, cupping it, and the unexpectedness of it nearly undid her more than the fence post had. "Where does it hurt?" "Ribs, left arm. I'm all right," she said again, because it needed to be true, so she was going to keep saying it. "Help me up." "You should stay—" "Silas." She looked at him directly. "Help me up." He got his arm under her right shoulder and lifted, and she went with it, and the world tilted and then settled, and she was standing. The pain across her left side was sharp and insistent, but she could breathe through it, which she knew from experience meant nothing was punctured. The girls reached them then. June with her arm around Elsie, both of them soaked through, both of them with the wide-open faces of children who'd just understood that something very serious had happened. "Mara," Elsie said, and the word had so much in it, fear and relief, and the particular kind of guilt that comes from knowing your action caused a consequence you didn't mean. "I'm standing," Mara said. "See? Standing." She looked at them steadily, making it true by holding their gaze. "Are you hurt?" "No," June said. Her voice was almost steady. Almost. "Good." Mara looked at Silas. "Get them inside." "I'm getting all of you inside," he said, in a tone that communicated this was not a discussion. They went. The storm was still screaming, but it was past its worst, the eye of whatever it was having moved north, and the rain was shifting from horizontal to merely very heavy. Silas had his arm around Mara, and she let him have it because her left side was not cooperating, and the ground was uneven, and mud was mud. They got to the porch. They got through the door. The warmth of the kitchen closed around them like something earned, and Mara sat down in the chair Silas pushed behind her knees and let herself sit, which was more of a surrender than she'd intended, but her body had some opinions about the fence post that she was going to have to negotiate with. The girls sat on the bench, wrapped in the blanket, watching her. Silas crouched in front of her and put his hands, carefully, on her left side. She breathed in sharply. "Probably 2 ribs," he said. "Maybe 1. They're not displaced, or you'd be a different color." "You know about ribs?" "I've broken enough of my own." He looked up at her. His face was still very close, and in the lamplight she could see things in it she hadn't been allowed to see clearly before. Not just the exhaustion and the guardedness, but something raw and recent, something that had happened in the last 20 minutes in the rain. "You ran at it," he said. "You ran at a panicking steer. It was going toward the girls. You could have been killed." "I wasn't. Mara." He said her name in a different register than usual. Not the flat, careful delivery he used most of the time, but something lower, something that came from the same place as the hands on her face in the rain. "I know. You weren't, but you could have been." She looked at him. She was wet, and her ribs were making their case very loudly, and she was sitting in mud-soaked clothes in a kitchen that smelled like rain and lamp oil, and she was not capable in this moment of managing what she saw in his face into something smaller and safer. "I know," she said. They stayed like that for a moment, his hands bracketing her injured side with the careful deliberateness of a man measuring what he's holding, her looking at him with the particular expression of someone who has run out of the energy to protect themselves and hasn't yet decided if that's catastrophic. Elsie broke it. "Is Mara going to be okay?" she asked, from the bench, in a very small voice. Silas sat back. The moment closed over. She's going to be okay, he said, and his voice was back to its usual register, but not quite, not fully. She's tough. I know, Elsie said, with the certainty of a child who'd arrived at this conclusion well before tonight and was glad to have it confirmed by the evidence. You two are getting baths in bed, Mara said. Right now. No arguments. You're hurt, and you're still bossing us around, June said. Yes, Mara said. That's how you know it's not serious. June looked at her for a long moment with those sharp, seeing eyes. Then she nodded, as if something had been decided. She took her sister's hand and they went upstairs without further argument, which was the most extraordinary thing either of them had done since Mara arrived. The kitchen was quiet. Silas got dry clothes from somewhere. He put them on the table beside her without looking at her, which was the diplomatic thing to do, and went to stoke the stove. She could feel him not looking at her, which was its own kind of looking. She changed in the small privacy of her room, moving carefully around the ribs, and when she came back out, he was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of something hot that was not coffee. She sat down across from him. What is this? She said. Broth. It was in the pot from earlier. She drank it. It tasted like the farm soup her grandmother used to make, which was a memory she hadn't touched in years. The storm moved off to the north. The rain settled into something quieter. The house was making the sounds a house makes when a storm has passed, creaking back into itself, settling, the kind of deep exhale that walls do when the pressure is finally off. She would have liked you, Silas said, without introduction. She looked at him. Clara, he said. He was looking at his cup. She would have, she appreciated people who didn't make a production of things, who just did what needed doing. He paused. I'm saying it badly. You're saying it fine, Mara said. I've been thinking. He stopped. Started again. I've been thinking that the ranch feels different than it did. And I know it's the work, the practical things, the fence and the water and the garden. I know it's all of that. But it's also, he looked up, it's you, in it. That's the difference. She was very still. I don't know how to say things like this, he said, with the frustrated honesty of a man who's been living inside language limitations for years and has just run up against them somewhere important. I'm better with... He gestured at the table, the imaginary papers, the practical work. I know, she said. I just want you to know that I see it. What you do, what you are here. He held her gaze. I see it. The rain fell soft outside the window. The stove ticked. Upstairs, she could hear the girls moving, the sounds of 2 children getting themselves to bed, the particular peaceful shuffling of people who'd been through something and come out and were now located in safety. Mara held her cup in both hands and looked at Silas Creed across the kitchen table in the lamplit dark and felt the thing she hadn't let herself feel settle in her chest like something finding the shape it was always supposed to fit. She didn't say, I've been thrown away by people who were supposed to love me, and I don't know how to trust what I feel. She didn't say, I'm afraid of this. She didn't say, I'm afraid that I've wanted something here and that if it's taken from me, I won't be able to go back to being the person who didn't. She said, I see you too, Silas. He nodded, just once, but it was the nod he used when something was settled. Not deferred, not uncertain, settled. And she'd learned to read that particular nod by now. Outside, the storm was done. The damage to the ranch would be assessed in the morning. The barn boards, the enclosure fence, whatever the wind had worked loose or knocked flat. There would be work. There was always work. The ribs would need binding, and she'd need to stay off her left arm for a week, and she was already calculating what she could do one-handed and what could wait. But right now it was just the kitchen and the lamp and the 2 cups on the table and a man who told her he saw her. She stayed at the table until the lamp burned low. She didn't go to her room. Neither did he. The morning after the storm, everything hurt. Mara was up at her usual hour despite the ribs, because the ribs didn't change the fact that the animals needed feeding and the storm damage needed assessing, and someone had to figure out what the night had cost them. She moved slower than usual, breathed shallower on the left side, and said nothing about any of it when she got the stove going and started the coffee. Silas came downstairs 20 minutes later and found her at the stove and stopped in the doorway. Sit down, he said. I'm making breakfast. Mara, sit down. She turned around to tell him she was fine, and the look on his face stopped her. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. The expression of a man who'd spent a night reckoning with something and had arrived at a position he wasn't moving from. She sat down. He made the breakfast. He did it without ceremony and without particular skill. The eggs were overdone, and the biscuits were from yesterday, re-warmed. But he did it, and he set the plate in front of her and poured her coffee and sat across from her like this was a thing he'd decided. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said, which was what she always said to him, and the echo of it was deliberate, and she felt it land. She ate the overdone eggs and didn't complain about them. The girls came down and assessed the situation with the rapid comprehension of children who understood that the dynamic in the room had changed overnight. June looked at her father at the stove and looked at Mara at the table with her arm held carefully and looked back at her father. She didn't say anything, which was unusual enough that Elsie noticed June's silence and looked around to find the cause of it. "Good morning," Mara said. "Good morning," they said back, with the careful politeness of people trying not to disturb something. They ate breakfast. Silas went out to assess the storm damage. Mara stayed at the table longer than she normally would and watched the girls get ready for school and listened to the ranch coming back to life in the morning. The animals, the wind that was calm now, the particular quiet of a landscape after a storm, which was different from regular quiet, cleaner somehow. Elsie stopped by her chair before she went out the door. She stood there for a moment, small and serious, and then she put her arms around Mara's neck from behind and held on for several seconds without saying anything. Mara put her right hand over the girl's hands. "Go to school," she said when Elsie let go. "Okay," Elsie said, and went. The damage to the ranch was significant but not ruinous. 2 barn boards had come loose, one section of the east fence was down entirely, and the kitchen garden had taken a beating. 3 of the bean poles were broken, and one of the potato beds had flooded and would need draining. The south enclosure gate latch needed replacing. A section of the porch railing, which had been marginal since before Mara arrived, had finally given up entirely and was lying in the yard. Silas assessed all of it without visible distress, which was the mark of a man who'd been through enough bad years that damage was just a list of things to do. He and Mara walked the property together in the morning light, him describing what he found and her noting it, left arm close to her body, ribs making themselves known on each exhale. "Porch railing," she said. "I'll replace the whole thing," he said. It was overdue. "East fence is the priority. If the cattle find that gap..." "I know. I'll start there this morning." He glanced at her. "You're not starting anything this morning. I can do one-handed work." "Mara." "The accounts, the preserves inventory, things that don't require 2 arms." He looked at her for a long moment. "Fine," he said. "Accounts." She did accounts. She also, because she was herself and couldn't help it, restaked 2 of the bean poles left-handed and drained the potato bed using a channel she dug with her good arm and a piece of the broken pole, which took twice as long as it should have and left her breathing carefully for 10 minutes afterward, but the bed was draining. When Silas came back for the midday meal and found the bean poles staked, he looked at them and then at her and then back at them. "Accounts," he said. "I also did the accounts," she said. He shook his head in a way that was not entirely disapproval and went to wash up. The ribs improved over the following week, with the dogged incrementalism of the body repairing itself. Each day marginally better than the last, each morning slightly less negotiation required to get upright. Silas had bound the ribs properly the morning after the storm, efficiently and without making her feel managed, and she'd kept them bound and kept her left arm close and let herself be slower than she liked. What she hadn't anticipated was what happened between her and Silas in the days after the storm. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the thing. There were no declarations, no significant moments that could be pointed to later. But the kitchen table evenings became more frequent, and the distance that had always been maintained, not large but deliberate, a few feet of careful air, was less deliberate now. He sat closer. Not inappropriately, not obviously, but closer. When he handed her things, he didn't hurry to take his hand back. Once, when she was reaching for something on the upper shelf that her ribs weren't ready for, he'd reached over from behind her without being asked and gotten it down. And his arm had been near enough to her shoulder that she'd felt the warmth of it, and neither of them had acknowledged it, and both of them had registered it. She was not naive about what was happening. She'd also learned enough about Silas Creed to understand that he didn't move quickly toward things he wasn't sure of, and that his sureness came from a different place than other people's. Not from words or declarations, but from a long, slow accumulation of evidence. He was building something in his own way. She could see the architecture of it. She was afraid of it, too. She was afraid of it in the specific, practical way that she was afraid of most things that mattered. Not with panic, but with a cold, clear awareness of what she stood to lose if it went wrong. She'd already lost the thing that had passed for a life back in Missouri. She'd been thrown out of it, and she'd survived. And she'd arrived here and built something. Not hers, not formally, but something she'd put herself into in a way she hadn't put herself into anything before. If this went wrong, she had nowhere else. She thought about that on a Thursday night when the house was asleep and she was still at the table, going over the winter preparation list, and found herself sitting there with the pencil not moving, just sitting in the kitchen that she'd cleaned and the house she'd repaired and looking at the wall where she'd hung a small bit of dried herbs, thyme from the garden. Because it smelled good, and because she'd wanted to, just because she'd wanted to, and that had been a new enough feeling that she'd acted on it before she could think better of it. She had done that. That small thing on the wall. She had done it like someone who lived here. She put the pencil down. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a while, but when she did, she slept hard, which was the sleep of a person whose body had decided to stop participating in the mind's arguments. The town came for her on a Saturday in October. Not with torches. Nothing so honest as that. It came in the particular form that small communities use when they've decided something needs addressing. A meeting. Specifically, the monthly town meeting at the Blackstone Ridge Meeting Hall, which dealt with things like road maintenance and water rights, and the perennial argument about whether to expand the schoolhouse, and which this month had apparently developed an additional item of business. She didn't know about it beforehand. Silas didn't know either. Or if he didn't know the full shape of what was coming. They went into town that Saturday, as they sometimes did, all four of them, for supplies in the mail. It was a cold October morning, the sky low and gray, the first real suggestion of the winter to come. The girls wore their heavier coats, and June complained about hers, which was last year's and tight in the shoulders. And Mara told her she'd let the seams out this week, and June accepted this with the air of someone granting a stay of execution. The trouble started at the general store. Pruitt was behind the counter, and he had two other men with him that Mara didn't recognize. Not customers, something else. Something about the angle of their standing that suggested they'd been waiting. An older woman named Mrs. Garfield, who sat on the town council and had never spoken directly to Mara, was near the window. Dorothy Price was there. And Mrs. Heller, of course. Mrs. Heller was always there when things were being said. Silas was at the counter. Mara was looking at the dry goods with the girls when she became aware of the quality of the room, the particular stillness of a group of people who are waiting for something to start. Pruitt cleared his throat. "Silas," he said, "we thought it might be good to talk, as a community." Silas turned around slowly. "About what?" "About the current arrangement at your ranch." Pruitt had the look of a man who'd been elected to say something he'd rather not be elected to say, but who'd convinced himself it was the right thing. "People have concerns." "People," Silas said. "The community." Pruitt gestured at the room. "We have a responsibility to the character of the town, to standards. And having an unattached woman living in your house, a woman nobody knows, whose background is—" "Her background," Silas said very quietly, "is none of your business. It's the community's business when it affects the community's reputation," Silas said. The word landed flat and cold. "Is that what we're talking about? My household is a threat to Blackstone Ridge's reputation?" "It's not appropriate," Mrs. Heller said, from her position near the door. She'd apparently decided that Pruitt needed reinforcement. "A widow woman alone in a man's house. Folks talk." "Folks have been talking since the day she stepped off the train," Silas said. "I've noticed." "Then you understand the concern." "What I understand," Silas said, "is that this woman has been on my property for 5 months. In that time, she has repaired my fences, restored my water line, maintained my house, and kept my daughters fed and clothed and in school on time. She ran at a panicking steer in a September storm to keep my girls from being hurt, and she took the impact herself and didn't say a word about it for a week afterward." His voice was level, completely level, which was somehow more effective than raised. What exactly is the nature of the community's concern? The room was quiet. Pruitt tried again. Silas, nobody's saying she isn't hardworking, but there are proper ways of doing things. There are proper ways, Silas agreed. You're right about that. He picked up his hat from the counter. He looked around the room, at Pruitt, at Mrs. Heller, at Mrs. Garfield by the window, at Dorothy Price, at the two men he didn't know. He took them all in with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who wanted people to understand they'd been seen. I'd like to tell you all something, he said, and then I'd like to not have this conversation again. Nobody spoke. That woman came here with nothing. She came here because she'd been told there was a job and then found out there wasn't. And she could have turned around and gone back to wherever she came from, but she didn't because she's not that kind of person. She walked into a house full of grief and a ranch full of problems, and she got to work. And she never asked me to notice, and she never asked for anything except to be let alone to do what needed doing. He paused. The town decided what she was before she'd been here a week. None of you know her. Not one of you. His eyes went to Mrs. Heller. And you, Helen, with all your concern about my household, did you know that it was her idea that saved me from selling 60 acres of my north pasture to Wendell Kane? Did you know she fixed my water line? Did you know she stayed up 2 nights running when June had a summer fever? And when I came downstairs at 3 a.m, she was still at the girl's bedside, and she hadn't woken me because she didn't want me to worry? He stopped. No, you didn't know any of that, because you never asked. Mrs. Heller's face had gone through several colors. She'd settled on something between indignation and discomfort, which was perhaps the most honest expression Mara had ever seen on her. Mara was standing at the back of the store with the girls. June's hand had found hers again. That particular habit, the small hand sliding in. Elsie was pressed against her right side. She had not moved. She had not said anything. She was not going to cry in Pruitt's general store, not in front of these people, not today. She made that decision clearly and held to it. The meeting hall tonight, Mrs. Garfield said from the window. Her voice was different from the others, not defensive, not hostile, something harder to read. There are formal concerns that have been raised. It's the appropriate place to address them. We'd ask you both to attend. Silas looked at her. Both of us. Both of you, Mrs. Garfield confirmed. She was looking at Mara as she said it. Not unkindly, not kindly either, just directly. The community should hear from her as well, if she's willing. A silence. Mara felt the weight of it, the room, the eyes, the 2 children pressed against her sides, Silas across the store with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, waiting. I'll be there, Mara said. Her voice came out even. She was moderately surprised. The meeting hall that evening was fuller than it had any right to be for a routine Saturday gathering, which told Mara everything she needed to know about how thoroughly the word had spread. People had come who didn't normally come. She could tell by the way they arranged themselves, the ones who were there for the performance of it filling the back rows, the regular attendees in their usual places near the front looking faintly embarrassed by the audience. She and Silas sat in the front, with the girls between them. The girls were in their good coats, the same ones they wore to school on picture day, and they sat very straight and did not fidget, which was the closest they came to being formally composed. Mara wore her best dress, which was not very fine, but was clean and pressed and dark blue, and she'd put her hair up properly. She'd done it all deliberately, taking her time, because she understood that appearances in a room like this were a form of argument, and she intended to make hers. Thomas Alderman, the husband, not the wife, which was a distinction that mattered, opened the meeting. He was a thin, mild man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Mara found herself pitying him slightly, which was a better feeling than what she'd been carrying toward his wife for the past several months. The formal concerns, as read by Alderman, were that an unattached woman of unclear moral standing was residing in the home of a widower with minor children, that this was contrary to community standards, that the community had a responsibility to the welfare of the children in question, and that the situation should be formalized or terminated. Formalized or terminated. The language of a business transaction applied to her life. She kept her face still. Several people spoke. Some were predictable. Mrs. Heller, 2 of the men from the store that morning. Dorothy Price surprised her by saying, carefully, That in her observation, the Creed household had been better maintained and the children better cared for in the past months than in the 2 years previous, and that she thought the community might consider whether their concern was actually for the children or for something else. Dorothy sat down looking like she'd surprised herself. Then Silas stood. He stood the way he did most things, without announcement, without performance. He stood up and he waited until the room was quiet, which didn't take long, because Silas Creed standing up and being quiet was a thing that commanded attention. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it in front of all of you because I'm done having it said in corners and stores and wherever else people have been saying it." He looked at the room. "My daughters are 7 years old. They lost their mother when they were 5. In the 2 years after that, I did the best I could, and my best was not always good enough. And I knew it. And there wasn't much I could do about it except keep going." He paused. "This woman came to my ranch with nothing, and she took a job that 2 other women before her had left, and she stayed. She stayed through a hard summer and a September storm and 5 months of this town looking at her sideways, and she never complained about any of it to me, not once. She repaired things I didn't have time to repair. She figured out problems I hadn't solved. She sat up with my daughters when they were sick, and she talked to them, and she listened to them, and she—" He stopped for a moment. His jaw worked. "My daughter Elsie told her teacher that Mara was good." That was the word she used. Good. Not clever, not helpful. Good. And Elsie is not a child who uses words carelessly. Mara kept her hands in her lap. She kept her face forward. She was not going to fall apart in the meeting hall of Blackstone Ridge. She was absolutely not going to do that. "You have concerns about formalization," Silas said, "about the propriety of the arrangement. So do I. That's actually something I've been thinking about for a while." He paused. Then he said, without looking away from the room, "I intend to ask her to marry me. I'm saying it here first because I'd like everyone in this room to understand that what follows is not a response to community pressure. It's a decision I've made on my own account. I'd have made it without this meeting. I'd have made it without any of you." The room was completely silent. Mara stared at the front wall of the meeting hall. She was aware of June's hand tightening around hers. "If that satisfies the concern about formalization," Silas said, "then I think we're done here." He sat down. Alderman looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked like a man who had been given a script that no longer applied. "I think," he said, and then stopped, because he clearly didn't know what he thought. Mrs. Garfield spoke from the third row. "I think Mr. Creed has addressed the community's concerns." Her voice was dry and efficient. "Shall we move on to the road maintenance discussion?" The room exhaled. People shifted. Someone near the back coughed. The particular social pressure that had been built up over the past several hours began, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, to release. Mrs. Heller was looking at her hands. Mara sat in the front row of the Blackstone Ridge meeting hall and listened to the road maintenance discussion begin and held June's hand and did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, because if she felt the full weight of it in this room, she would not be able to hold herself together. And she had held herself together in worse rooms than this one. Elsie leaned up and put her mouth near Mara's ear. "Are you going to say yes?" she whispered. Mara looked at her. This small, serious child with her dark eyes and her grandmother's braid and her absolute conviction in the rightness of things she'd decided. "He hasn't asked me yet," Mara whispered back. "He said he was going to." "He did. So are you going to say yes?" Mara held the girl's gaze. She thought about the east-facing window in the small room off the kitchen. She thought about the kitchen table at midnight and the cold coffee and the papers between them. She thought about the north pasture with water running through it. She thought about Gerald the cat and the time on the wall and 2 overdone eggs put in front of her by a man who'd decided to make breakfast. "I'm thinking about it," she said, which was not untrue. Elsie gave her the long look of a child who knows when an adult is being evasive but has decided to allow it for the moment. "Okay," Elsie said and sat back. After the meeting, on the steps of the hall, several things happened in quick succession. Dorothy Price stopped and spoke to Mara. Briefly, without flourish, just stopped and said that she thought the ranch looked better than it had in years and that the girls looked well, and then she moved on before it had to become anything more than it was. An older man Mara didn't know shook Silas's hand and said something too low to hear, and Mrs. Heller walked past them on the steps. She didn't stop. She didn't apologize, which was perhaps too much to expect, but she slowed, slightly, when she came level with Mara, and she looked at her with an expression that was not warm but was, for the first time, something other than dismissal. A look that acknowledged, without saying so, that a reckoning had occurred. Then she kept walking. Mara watched her go. She didn't feel triumph about it. She felt something more complicated. The particular exhaustion of a person who's been fighting a thing for so long that when the fight reduces, they don't know immediately what to do with the quiet. Silas was beside her on the steps, close beside her, in the way he'd been close since the storm. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. I want to." He stopped, and she could see him working through the language problem again, the familiar frustration of a man whose fluency was in actions rather than words. "Not here," he said finally. "Not like this. I want to ask you properly." "Okay," she said. "That's not a no." "It's not a no," she said. And he heard everything she meant by it and nodded, that particular nod. The girls were ahead of them on the steps, already at the wagon, June helping Elsie up and then climbing up herself, both of them looking back at the two adults with the barely concealed attention of people pretending not to watch. Mara looked at them, her two girls in their good coats in the October dark. And then she looked at the town around them, the lit windows, the evening settling over Blackstone Ridge, and she felt the shift in the air that was not just the cold coming on, but something else, a change in the pressure of the place, the particular atmospheric change that happens when something that was held against you stops being held. Not forgiven, not forgotten, not the clean ending of a story where everything resolves neatly, but something real, moving in the direction of something better. She walked down the steps and across to the wagon, and Silas walked beside her, and the sound their boots made on the ground was the ordinary sound of two people going somewhere together, which was the closest thing to a declaration either of them needed right now. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Silas climbed up beside her. He gathered the reins. He clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon moved off down the Blackstone Ridge Main Street, past the lit windows and the people who'd come out to watch the evening settle, past the store and the post office and the meeting hall behind them. June leaned forward from the wagon bed and put her chin on Mara's shoulder. "You're staying," she said. Not a question. Mara put her hand over June's where it rested on her shoulder. "I'm staying," she said. The wagon went north, toward the ranch, toward the lamp they'd left burning in the kitchen window, toward the east-facing room and the garden, and the cat who left offerings on the porch and the table where two people sat until the coffee went cold. The road was dark, and the stars were out, and Mara Holloway, who had arrived in this country with $12 and a worn-out bag and the kind of shame that takes up residence in your chest and starts to feel like it belongs there, sat on the wagon seat with a man's arm close to hers and two children behind her and the prairie opening up ahead, and she let herself, for the first time, feel the full weight of it, all of it. It was heavy. It was the weight of everything she'd carried and everything she'd built and everything she hadn't let herself want until it was already too late to stop wanting it. She could carry this weight. She'd always been good at carrying things. He asked her on a Sunday morning, 11 days after the meeting hall. Not dramatically, not on one knee in the parlor with the lamps lit and the girls watching from the stairs, though she suspected June had lobbied for something like that. He asked her the way he did most important things, plainly, without staging, in a moment that hadn't been arranged. She was in the garden. The October garden was mostly put to bed by then. The last of the root vegetables pulled, the beds turned and mulched against the coming frost, the bean poles stored in the barn. She was doing a final check of the herb patch along the south wall, the thyme and sage that had survived the September storm better than she'd expected, cutting back the dead growth so the roots could winter properly. Her hands were cold. She hadn't brought her gloves out. She heard him come across the yard. She didn't turn around. She knew his footsteps by now, the particular weight and rhythm of them, the way he moved across ground he'd walked 10,000 times. He stopped behind her. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was working up to something. "Mara," he said. "The sage is going to come back strong in spring," she said. "The thyme too, if the frost isn't too hard." "I'm not talking about the sage." She turned around. He was standing there in his work coat with his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed something and then decided in the last moment to abandon the rehearsal and just say the true thing. "I know what you came here with," he said. I know it wasn't much, and I know you've been careful not to count on anything because counting on things has cost you before. I don't have fancy words for this. You know I don't. He stopped, started again. You fixed what was broken here. Not just the fence and the water and the house. The other things. The harder things. He looked at her steadily. I want you to stay. Not as a position. Not as an arrangement. I want you to stay because this place is yours as much as it's mine now. And I think we both know that. And I'd like to say it properly if you'll let me. The sage smelled sharp in the cold morning air. From the barn, Gerald made his opinions known about something. The prairie spread out behind her, wide and indifferent and beautiful. That's not a question yet, she said, because she needed to hear him say it. The corner of his mouth moved. Mara Holloway, will you marry me? It wasn't phrased as a question. It came out like a statement, like something he'd already determined was true, and was simply confirming. And it was so entirely him, so completely the way he said everything important, that she felt something in her chest release that she hadn't fully known was still held. Yes, she said. He nodded, the nod of a settled thing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and held it out to her. A ring. Plain silver, thin band, a small, dark stone she didn't immediately recognize. It was my grandmother's, he said, not Clara's. I want you to know that. It was in a box in the barn loft and I found it last week and I thought, he looked at it. It doesn't have to be this one. If you want something else, give it to me, she said. He put it on her finger. It fit him perfectly, slightly loose on her cold hand, and he held her hand for a moment after, both his hands around hers, and they stood in the garden in the October morning with the dead herb stalks around them and the frost coming and the ranch breathing around them in all directions. And it was not a perfect moment. Her hands were dirty. His coat had a tear in the left elbow she'd been meaning to mend for 2 weeks. The ring was loose. It was the truest moment she'd ever been in. The girls came out of the house. She heard the screen door and the particular thundering descent of 2 children who had been watching from the kitchen window and had apparently decided that waiting any longer was not possible. June reached her first because June always reached things first, and she grabbed Mara's hand and looked at the ring, and then looked up with an expression of triumphant satisfaction so complete it was almost funny. I told Elsie you'd say yes, she said. Did you? Mara said. She wasn't sure. I was sure. Elsie arrived at a slight delay and stood looking at both of them with the more complex emotion of a child who had wanted something for so long that its arrival required a moment of processing. Then she put her arms around Mara's waist, carefully, the ribs were still remembering themselves, and held on. Mara held her back with her right arm, the ring hand, the loose silver ring catching the morning light. Silas stood slightly apart from them, watching, and she looked at him over Elsie's head and he looked back at her. And what passed between them in that look was not the language of romance, but something older and more solid. The look of 2 people who have worked alongside each other long enough to understand what the other is made of, and who have chosen each other anyway, with full knowledge of all the imperfections that knowledge implies. That was the proposal. That was what it looked like. Nothing cinematic about it. Just a garden and cold hands and a ring that didn't quite fit, and 2 girls and a man who'd put his hat back on and was already thinking about the morning's work, and Mara Holloway standing in it all thinking that she had never, not once in her 24 years, been in a moment that felt this much like the right place. The wedding was in November, which was perhaps not the most festive month for a wedding in the High Plains, but Mara had no family coming and Silas had no patience for elaborate planning, and the girls voted for sooner, so November it was. It was not a large event. They asked it to be small. The reverend from the church in town, a quiet man named Holt, who had never been among those judging her, which she'd noted, performed the ceremony on a Thursday afternoon at the ranch. The witness list was short. Fletcher from the neighboring spread, and his wife, who had always been decent to her. Dorothy Price, who had surprised her at the meeting and had been slowly, carefully, becoming something close to a neighbor in the months since, and Mrs. Garfield from the town council, whose presence was a statement of its own kind. The girls wore their good dresses. June's had been let out at the shoulders, finally, and she stood in the parlor looking at herself in the small mirror with the expression of someone assessing the results of a long campaign. Elsie had put flowers in her braid, dried ones from the summer garden, thyme and a bit of sage. and she wore them with the gravity of someone performing a ceremonial function. Mara wore dark green. It was not white, and it was not fine, and she had made it herself over the previous 3 weeks, working in the evenings when the house was quiet, and it fit her properly. All of her, the whole of her, without apology. And when she looked at herself in the mirror that Thursday morning, she thought, "This is what I look like when I'm not trying to be smaller." She looked like herself. She decided that was enough. She decided it was more than enough. The ceremony was brief. Silas said his words in his flat, serious delivery that made them sound like facts rather than vows, which was the most romantic thing she could imagine coming from him. She said hers clearly, without trembling, which she considered a personal achievement given the full weight of what was being said. Reverend Holt pronounced them married. June burst into applause. Elsie burst into tears, which surprised everyone, including Elsie, who looked briefly mortified and then decided to keep crying because she'd started, and it seemed like the honest thing to do. Silas looked at Mara. Something passed through his face that she'd seen only once before. In the kitchen after the storm, that brief unguarded look under the usual flatness. It was there for only a moment, and then it was contained again, put back behind the reserve he'd built over years of managing alone. But she'd seen it, and she filed it away in the part of herself that collected small good things, which had become considerably fuller in the past 6 months. He kissed her. It was brief and slightly awkward because June was still applauding and Elsie was still crying, and Fletcher was saying something congratulatory, and it was not a cinematic kiss. It was the kiss of two people who are going to have to figure out who they are to each other over time, which was not a romantic thought, but was the true one. They had cake. Dorothy Price had brought it. A simple apple cake, which was the right thing for November, and it was very good. Gerald the cat appeared at the parlor window at some point and regarded the proceedings with the expression of an entity that had decided this outcome was satisfactory and took partial credit for it. It was not a perfect day. The stove smoked for 20 minutes in the afternoon, and Mara had to fix the flue damper while still in her green dress, which Silas tried to take over, and she didn't let him. Fletcher's wife knocked a glass off the table and it broke, which everyone laughed about except Fletcher, who looked guilty. June ate too much cake and had opinions about it afterward. Elsie fell asleep in the parlor chair during the adults' conversation and had to be carried upstairs. It was a real day. That was the thing. It was completely, entirely real, and nothing about it was arranged for how it looked. And when the guests had gone and the parlor was quiet and the girls were asleep and the ranch was doing what it did at night, breathing in the dark, settling into itself, Mara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the north pasture where the water ran through channels she'd designed on a piece of paper at this same table. And she was a married woman in a house that was hers, and she let herself know that. "What are you thinking?" Silas said from the doorway. "I'm thinking the potato beds need a heavier mulch if we're going to winter them properly," she said. A pause. "That's what you're thinking." "That and other things." He came to stand beside her at the window. They stood looking at the dark pasture together, two people who had discovered that standing next to each other in silence was one of the things they did best. "I'm glad you didn't turn around and go back," he said. She considered that. "I didn't have anywhere to go back to." Still, she agreed. What came after was not simple. She'd known it wouldn't be, and she was right. The town didn't transform overnight. Towns don't. Blackstone Ridge continued being what it was, a closed, hard-built community with long memories and slow trust. And Mara continued being what she was, which was a woman who didn't fit the expected shape and had stopped trying to. Some people remained cool. Mrs. Heller never became warm, though she became gradually and apparently painfully civil. Pruitt at the general store improved incrementally over the following months, which Mara attributed partly to changed circumstance and partly to the fact that she now bought considerably more from him as the ranch's needs grew, and money had a clarifying effect on social attitudes that no amount of moral argument could replicate. What changed was subtler and more significant than the town's opinion. What changed was the daily texture of living. Silas slept. She noticed it first in November, a week after the wedding. She woke in the early morning, that hour before the house stirred, and the house was quiet, in a way it hadn't been before. No footsteps, no movement in the kitchen below. She lay there and listened to the absence of his insomnia and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was a blend of both. She mentioned it once, just once. "You've been sleeping." He looked at her with the slight surprise of a man who hadn't noticed something about himself. "Have I?" "Since about 2 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. "Huh," he said, which was his version of an extensive emotional acknowledgement, and she accepted it as such. The girls flourished in the specific, complicated way that children flourish when they have what they need. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, but with the stubbornness and forward motion of living things given adequate conditions. June remained June, opinionated, restless, constantly in motion, the child who would negotiate with the world until it gave her what she'd decided she wanted. Mara recognized something of herself in June's stubbornness, and she tempered it the way she'd learned to temper her own, not by flattening it, but by redirecting it, teaching her that determination needed a worthy target. Elsie grew quieter in a good way, the quietness of a child who felt secure enough to stop watching for danger. She'd taken to sitting near Mara in the evenings with her reading, not requiring conversation, just requiring proximity, which was the kind of company Mara understood best. She asked better questions as the months went on. Harder ones? The kind that didn't have clean answers. About why people were the way they were. About fairness. About the things that happened to people that weren't their fault.
"Why did your family send you away?" Elsie asked one evening in January. Just like that, the way she asked things. Mara was quiet for a moment. She'd known this question was coming eventually. Elsie had been building toward it for months. "Because I didn't fit what they needed me to be," she said, finally. "And instead of making room for me to be different, they made room without me." Elsie thought about this with the careful seriousness she brought to important things. "That was wrong," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "It was." "Does it still hurt?" Mara looked at her. This child who asked the question without flinching, who wanted the real answer and not the managed one. "Sometimes," she said, "less than it used to. The hurt changes shape over time. It doesn't disappear, but it gets smaller compared to other things." "What other things?" Mara looked around the kitchen, the lamp, the table, the herb on the wall, the sound of Silas and June's argument about something carrying from the parlor, whatever was still out in the winter dark performing its permanent dissatisfaction with the world. "This," she said, "mostly this." Elsie nodded slowly, as if adding this to a record she was keeping. Then she went back to her reading, and Mara went back to mending, and the kitchen held them both in its ordinary winter light. Spring came late that year, which was typical for the High Plains, where winter didn't release its hold so much as loosen it grudgingly over a period of weeks that felt like months. But when it came into the garden Mara had put to bed in October and found it ready. The thyme came back strong, as she'd predicted. The sage came back stronger than it had been the year before. The potato bed she'd mulched heavily survived without loss. The bean poles she'd stored in the barn went back up into soil she'd spent a year improving, and the first seeds went in on an April morning when the ground was still cold but willing. Silas helped that spring, which was new. He'd always left the garden to her. It was her domain, her knowledge. But in April, he came out one morning with the second-best pair of gloves and stood at the edge of the potato bed and said, "Show me." She showed him. He was not a natural gardener. He was too impatient with the slow parts and had opinions about the spacing that were not based on evidence. But he tried, and he listened when she corrected him, and by the end of the morning they'd gotten 3 beds planted and he'd only argued with her twice about the spacing, which she counted as progress. "You were right about the spacing," he said at the end. "I know," she said. "You don't have to say it like that." "Like what?" "Like you were waiting for me to admit it." "I was," she said, and the look she gave him when she said it made him laugh. Actually laugh, the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, which was still rare enough that it was worth noting every time it appeared. She noted it. The ranch had changed in the way that things change when they are properly attended to. Not transformed, not suddenly perfect, but better in the incremental, grounded way of real improvement. The north pasture with its redirected water had produced better through the previous year than in years before. The south enclosure gate had a new latch that didn't fail in storms. The barn had been re-sided on the east wall. The porch railing was new entirely and level, and Silas had built it wider than the original, which gave the girls room to sit on it in the evenings without fighting over territory,
which had been a recurring crisis in the summer before. The house breathed differently. That was the only way Mara could describe it to herself. It breathed like a house that was inhabited by people rather than endured by them. The curtains in the parlor stayed open. The photograph of Clara was still on the mantelpiece. It would always be there, and it should be. And Mara had never had a moment's conflict about it because Clara was the girl's mother, and Silas's grief was real and deserved its place. She'd simply added things around it over time, a small dried flower arrangement from the summer garden, a drawing June had made of the ranch that was technically rough but emotionally accurate, a chip of polished stone Elsie had found in the creek and decided was important. The mantelpiece became a shelf of the house's accumulation rather than a shrine to its absence. She wrote to her mother in March. It took her 6 drafts and she burned the first 4 and rewrote the 5th 3 times. The final letter was not long. She told her mother that she was well. She told her she was married and where she was and what the ranch was like. She told her about the girls. She did not say, "You threw me away and I survived it." She did not say, "I am more myself here than I ever was when you were telling me who to be." She did not say any of the things that lived in the drafts she'd burned. What she said at the end was, "I have found a place where I am allowed to be the size I am. I hope you are well. Mara." She didn't know if her mother would write back. She didn't need her to. The letter was not a demand for anything. It was just a record, a marker she was leaving that said, "I existed and I did not disappear, and I am here." Her mother wrote back in May. The letter was short and careful and formal, in the way her mother was formal when she was navigating something she didn't have the vocabulary for. It said she was glad Mara was settled. It said the family was well. It said, in the last line in her mother's cramped handwriting, "I hope the girls are good to you." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." But that last line, that single acknowledgement that Mara had girls, that there were girls to be good to her, was something. It was the most her mother had ever done with the limited emotional vocabulary she'd been given, and Mara recognized it for what it was. She put the letter in the drawer of the bedside table and didn't take it out again, but she didn't burn it either. Some things you keep even when they're not enough. You keep them because they're what there is, and because holding a small, true thing is better than holding nothing. By the summer of the second year, the summer of their first full year as a proper family, with the wedding behind them, and the winter survived, and the spring planted, and the garden coming in, Blackstone Ridge had arrived at something that was not acceptance exactly, but was the next thing over from it. The social weather had shifted in the way that weather eventually shifts in closed communities when the fact of someone's presence becomes more undeniable than the community's resistance to it. Mara had become, without campaign or strategy, simply someone who was there. She was the woman at the Creed Ranch, the one who'd figured out the water problem and put up more preserves than anyone's cellar could hold, and whose daughters, people had started calling them her daughters, just like that, without ceremony, were growing up well and said please and thank you, and had good sense. She was the woman who'd run at the steer in the storm. That story had gotten around eventually, the way stories do in small towns, moving from person to person through the winter months until it arrived back to her in a version that was slightly more dramatic than the original, but essentially true. Dorothy Price became a genuine friend, which was something Mara hadn't expected and accepted carefully, the way she accepted good things now, with gratitude and without too much pressure on them, letting them be what they were. Dorothy was a practical woman with a dry sense of humor and opinions about everything, and they disagreed regularly and specifically and without injury, which was Mara's definition of a good friendship. There was an afternoon in June, just an ordinary afternoon, when she was in the kitchen and she heard the wagon coming up the drive, and she knew without looking that it was the girls coming back from school. And she heard June arguing before the wagon had even properly stopped, something about a decision made at recess that June found unjust. And she heard Silas saying June in the patient, practiced tone he'd developed for exactly this. And she heard Elsie's quieter voice adding something that was probably the accurate version of events. And the screen door banged open and June came in already talking, and Elsie came in behind her, and Gerald materialized from somewhere demanding his afternoon tribute. And the kitchen filled up with everything it usually filled up with. Mara was at the counter, not doing anything particularly important, just standing there in the noise and motion of her own household. In the kitchen, she'd scrubbed on her hands and knees her first week here, under the herbs she'd hung on the wall just because she'd wanted to.
June came to the end of her account of the injustice and looked at her expectantly. "What do you think?" she demanded. Mara considered. "I think you're probably right about the facts and wrong about how you handled it." June opened her mouth. "And I think there's cornbread for after supper if you can tell me what you'd do differently next time." June closed her mouth. She thought about it with the focused resentment of someone who doesn't want to be reasonable but is going to be anyway. "I'd say it calmly," she said, finally, in a tone that suggested calm was the cross she'd been asked to bear. "Good," Mara said. "Wash your hands."
Silas came in from the barn 20 minutes later when the supper was almost ready, and he stood in the doorway for a moment the way he sometimes did, not stopping for any reason, just pausing. And she turned and found him looking at her with the expression she'd learned to recognize, that flatness with the thing underneath it, the thing he showed her now in moments when he wasn't guarding it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking. The supper's going to burn if you keep the door open." He closed the door. He sat down at the table. Elsie climbed into the chair beside him and immediately began telling him something about a book she was reading, and June took the chair across and resumed her argument with Elsie about the recess incident from a new angle. And the kitchen was loud and imperfect, and the cornbread was slightly darker on one side than it should have been. And Mara served the supper and sat down among them. This is what she thought about sometimes, when the quieter part of her mind had room to think, that you could be thrown away from one life and find another, and the second one didn't cancel out the pain of the first, but it could be so real and so full that the first became something that happened to you rather than something that defined you. That the people who decided you were worthless before they knew you were not authorities on your worth. That the wilderness, the actual wilderness, the hard indifferent prairie that didn't care whether you fit or not, could reveal something that managed people never could. What you were actually made of when no one was managing you. She was made of stubbornness and practicality, and a capacity for work that had alarmed people her whole life. She was made of the ability to pay attention to things, small things, necessary things, the things that kept a household from falling apart, and a water line from failing, and a child from feeling unseen. She was made of the inability to be smaller than she was, which had cost her everything once and had, in the end, given her everything she had. She was not a perfect woman. She was still short-tempered sometimes, and too blunt, and she had nights where the old voice came back and told her this would be taken away, that she didn't deserve it, that the people who'd thrown her away had been right. Those nights were less frequent than they'd been. They were not gone. She was not a perfect wife, or a perfect mother, or a perfect member of the Blackstone Ridge community, and she'd stopped being interested in perfect. Perfect was a shape that required you to cut off parts of yourself to fit it, and she'd done enough of that. What she was, present, whole, located for the first time in the right place. The summer ran long and golden the way the best summers do. Not too hot, with good rain, the kind of season that makes up for the difficult ones and tucks something in reserve for the hard winters to come. The garden gave more than she could put up, and she gave preserves to Dorothy Price and to the school and to the old man across the road, whose name she'd finally learned was Carl, and who'd turned out to be pleasant company for 15 minutes at a time, which was the correct duration for Carl. In August, on the anniversary of the storm, the 1-year mark, though nobody made a formal announcement of it, Silas came in from the barn in the evening and found her at the kitchen table, which was where she often was, and he stood in the doorway with the particular quality of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. "The pasture looks good," he said. "It does," she agreed. "Better than it's looked in years." "Yes." He came and sat across from her. He put his arms on the table. He looked at her in the lamplit kitchen with the same eyes she'd looked into the day he'd asked her on the street whether she had people in town, and she'd said no. And he'd told her about the position at the ranch with a flatness that had concealed what she now understood was a kind of desperate hope. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's generally a good sign with you," she said. "The ranch is doing well, better than I expected." "Better than you had reason to expect," she said, which was honest. "Yes." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I know that. What we've built here. I want you to know I know the difference." She held his gaze. "I know you know," she said. He nodded. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was not a thing he did with regularity, which was why he did it with such weight when he did. They sat like that for a while. The lamp burned between them. The girls were upstairs. She could hear the soft sounds of two children settling toward sleep. Outside, the night was warm and smelled like the garden, like the thyme along the south wall that would winter well and come back next year and the year after, as long as the soil was tended. She turned her hand over under his and held it. This was the life she had. Not the life she'd been told she deserved, which was nothing. Not the life she'd fantasized about, which had been vague and secondhand, assembled from other people's ideas of what a woman like her might be allowed to want. This life, specific, imperfect, built piece by piece from work and attention and the willingness to stay when staying was hard. She had stayed. That was the whole of it, when she let herself see it plainly. She had stayed when they told her to go. She had stayed when the town looked through her. She had stayed when the work was hard and the ribs hurt, and the voice inside said, "See, you knew you didn't belong." She had stayed not because she was brave. She wasn't sure she believed in bravery as a category distinct from stubbornness, but because she'd recognized in some bone-deep way that this was the place where she was allowed to be exactly as large as she was. And the land had done what land does when you work it properly. It had given back. Not because she deserved it, not because the story owed her a good ending, but because she'd put herself into it fully, without reservation, and things that are tended tend to grow. The time would come back in spring. The north pasture would water itself through the channels she'd designed. June would argue her way through childhood into an adulthood that would give some future community plenty to think about, and Elsie would ask questions that didn't have clean answers and keep asking until she'd worked out her own. And Silas would say important things plainly and do the rest in actions, which was the only language he'd ever fully trusted. And Mara Holloway, Mara Creed now, though she sometimes still thought of herself by the name she'd carried through the hard years, because that woman deserved to be remembered too, would get up before the sun and check the garden and fix what needed fixing and make the coffee and keep the accounts and pay attention to the small things. Because the small things were almost always the true things, and she had always been good at paying attention. That was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough. It was everything.